You're listening to The Secret to My Success, an interview-style podcast that asks our guests what trait, skill, or characteristic they possess that's made them a success. Hosted by Shelby Skurhawk.
So tell me, what bad habit do you want to get rid of? I know we all have bad habits. I mean, that's what makes us human. When I think about my worst habit, it had to have been my very bad Diet Coke habit. For a while there, I was drinking well over 6 and I don't even want to admit, probably 8 Diet Cokes a day. Why'd I do that? Well, I mean, yes, I like Diet Coke. I like the taste of it. But it was also a habit of convenience. I mean, between going to fill up a water bottle, which sounds incredibly lazy that I couldn't manage to do that, or grabbing a Coke from the fridge, it was just so much easier to grab that Diet Coke. James Clear, my guest today, he's got an interesting take on that. Now, he's the author of Atomic Habits, an easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. Now, James is an author, a speaker. He talks a lot about habits and decision-making and just continuous improvement. His website, jamesclear.com, gets over 1 million visitors a month, and that's quite a feat for somebody that doesn't describe himself as a writer at all. He just basically made a habit of writing twice a week. But in the book, James talks about a study where a hospital had installed water stations near where the soda machines were. They also put them right by the cash registers. And they found that water consumption rose significantly when they changed the location of the water and made it just as convenient to purchase as it was a soda. Makes sense, right? Well, James says that there's actually a lot that goes into that decision process for people choosing water over a soda. And it has to do with habits, and it has to do with how convenient things are. So when a good habit is convenient for you to do, you're more likely to do it. So what happened in my case is that when LaCroix and all of these sparkling waters started to become popular, I found it just as easy to grab a sparkling water in a can than I did a Diet Coke in a can. And as a result, I've pretty much replaced my entire Diet Coke habit. I have 1, maybe 2 a day, and it was a lot easier than I ever imagined it would be because I was able to replace a bad habit with a good habit very easily and seamlessly. So let's think about that bad habit that you have. What in your life makes it super easy for you to repeat that habit? And then conversely, think about what would make it more difficult? What would put an obstacle between you and that thing that you want to avoid doing? So listen for James's 4 elements of a habit, whether good or bad. And you'll realize, like I did, that change happens 1% at a time. And that's all you're asking of yourself, is to change just 1% a day. I mean, that's what this is all about. So here's James Clear. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, happy to talk to you. Thanks for having me on.
So you opened the book with an interesting story from your childhood, and it has to do with an accident that you had on the baseball field, and it ended up leaving you in a medically induced coma. Will you share that story and share how coming back from that incident really kind of led to this whole habits movement?
Sure. So the introduction to Atomic Habits talks about all the gory details, in addition to the recovery process. But the quick version is that I was hit in the face with a baseball bat and shattered both eye sockets, broke my nose, broke the bone behind my nose. It's called your ethmoid bone. It's like pretty deep within your skull, hard to break. So very serious injury, very significant blow. And I was able to walk to the nurse's office and answer questions for about 10 to 15 minutes, but I pretty quickly started answering all of them incorrectly. They'd be like, what year is it? And it was 2002, but I would say 1998. Or who's the president? And I would say Bill Clinton, but it was actually George W. Bush. So it was apparent very quickly that something was wrong. And because of the swelling in my brain, I started going downhill pretty fast. So, I started to struggle with basic functions like swallowing, and I couldn't breathe on my own. Had to be intubated and air carried to the hospital, and had multiple seizures over the next 24 hours. And eventually, I was placed into this coma that night to try to stabilize me. And then thankfully the next day I was to the point where I could be released from it. there were all kinds of things that happened in the weeks that followed. When I went to physical therapy, I started by doing really basic stuff. In my first session was practicing walking in a straight line. It took me, I couldn't drive a car for 8 or 9 months. So it took a long time to recover from that. And the punchline to it all is that, in a sense, my hand was forced. Like I couldn't just flip a switch and magically be transformed, or like go back to who I was before, or fix things overnight. Like there wasn't really the possibility for a radical transformation. So because of that, I had to just stop thinking about what was taken away from me and focus on little ways that I could get better each day. Some of them were very small, like, making sure I made my bed every morning, or getting to sleep at a reasonable hour each night, or making sure I was prepared and studying for before each class and things like that. And then eventually those little habits gave me like a sense of control over my life again. I started to like regain a little bit of what I felt like I had lost, and it started to ripple into these other areas. So pretty soon I was, strength training a couple times a week, and continued to improve in the classroom and so on. And after 5 years or so, I continued playing baseball, and I played it all the way through college. And my senior season, I was an academic All-American and had this really great year. And that was only possible because I had been committed to making these small daily improvements for the 5 years after the injury. I don't really think there's anything like magical or heroic about my story. Everybody has something that they deal with. Mine just happened to be that injury. But I do think that I was able to fulfill my potential, and that those small, daily, consistent habits were a big part of that story. There also were the people around me. But I think that small habits can also be a method for anyone else to try to achieve their potential. And that was one of the reasons why I shared my story in the introduction of the book, and why I wrote Atomic Habits, because I feel like understanding what habits are and how they work and how to design them to your liking is a really powerful way to achieve whatever you're looking to achieve, whatever particular domain you happen to be working in.
Right. Well, I like how you open the book with this story, because it shows how all of those little habits that a lot of us don't think about and take for granted. And you explain in the book that by definition, habits are things that we don't think about. But by having all of those building blocks kind of wiped away all at once, like a big Jenga tower just knocked down, and you had to build those up little by little, it helped you, I guess, really study the elements of habit building and good habits and bad habits. And that's the title of the book, Atomic Habits: An Easy and Proven Way to Build Good Habits and Break Bad Ones.
Yeah, I think that's true. I didn't have a language for it at the time. I was practicing it, but it wasn't until a couple years later, when I started writing about habits and had graduated and started working on the work that I'm doing now, that I was able to kind of put all the pieces together and connect the dots. And so in a sense, the book is kind of like the merger between those two worlds for me, the world where I was experimenting with that and having to put it into practice and living it out. And then the last, 5 years or so where I've been researching and writing about it.
Right. One thing that I found interesting. So, I mean, and you had mentioned it before, that going off to college, you were trying to get to bed at a reasonable hour, and you were keeping your room neat. But I found it interesting that you pointed out that gave you a sense of control. And that's something that I hadn't thought about before. That something as simple as making your bed in the morning could shift your thinking and help you, I guess, feel some of that self-control in your life. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know exactly why. I guess I'll say it reduces uncertainty. And whenever uncertainty is reduced, we feel like we're more in control. We feel like we know what to expect and what's about to occur. And so little habits like making your bed each morning, it reduces the uncertainty or chaos or disorder of your bedroom. And that feels good. And habits give you that control. They also sometimes and this is a recurring theme throughout the book, that habits can either work for you or against you. They're this double-edged sword. And so it becomes really important to understand what they are and how they work and how to shape them if you want to avoid the dangerous half of that double-edged sword, or shape them in a way that makes you feel like you're in control, not out of control. Because a lot of us feel like we're victims of our habits. We feel like they're happening to us. So I think it's really the process of taking the reins and of shaping a good habit, or of taking control of a bad one, that gives you that sense of power. I wasn't really expecting that either. It just kind of came naturally. And we've all experienced this. There's a little bit of like momentum or power that comes from getting a small task done. You like organize the kitchen counter, and then that motivates you to go throw the laundry in, and then you're, off to the store to do some more stuff on your to-do list and whatever. And you just kind of like one thing feeds into the next. Often we dismiss small habits because it seems like, well, why bother? Like, what's making my bed going to do for me? That's not going to change my life. But it can provide a little bit of momentum, get you moving in the right direction, be a signal of having control over your life, which changes your mindset a little bit and gives you a better way to look at daily life. And it can also reinforce your identity a little bit. I mean, like every morning that you make your bed, you embody the identity of someone who is clean and organized. Every time you go to the gym, even if it's just for 5 minutes, you embody the identity of someone who is fit. If you write one sentence, you embody the identity of someone who is a writer. So these small habits, even though they can seem insignificant if all you're thinking about is the immediate outcome, they can do some meaningful things. That's the paradox of small habits. I mean, if it's meaningful, it actually is a big thing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the backbone of the book, and that's the basis of all habits. You point to 4 things: cue, craving, response, and reward. And you say that these are very cyclical, or it kind of goes into a feedback cycle. So let's go through those one at a time and explain, what we're talking about.
So the cue is what initiates the feedback loop, or that cycle that you're mentioning. So, pretty much all habits, and honestly, the majority of human behaviors are going to go through a cycle that is like these 4 stages. So take a very simple habit like flipping on the light switch when you walk into a room. We don't think about it. It happens in half a second. You walk into the room is dark. That's the cue, visual cue in this case. Then you have some kind of craving. And craving, we often use that word to talk about craving a cigarette or craving a donut or something like that. But I mean it in an even broader sense here. The desire to change your state. You notice that you're in a current situation and you want to change that situation just a little bit. And so the craving is the prediction, or how you interpret the cue, how you interpret your current state, and what you predict you should do next. So that prediction stage, that interpretation stage, that's actually what motivates you to act. If you walked into a dark room and you wanted to be in a dark room, then you wouldn't flip on the light switch. So response, you flip on the light switch. So the response or the routine is pretty simple. It's just the action you perform. And then the reward is how it serves you or how it benefits you. And often the purpose of the reward is to reduce or resolve the craving that you had before you took an action. So the craving motivates you to act. The reward gives you a reason for acting or satisfies the craving that you had. And what ends up happening is that little loop, those 4 stages, you go through them real quick. And that process of going through those 4 stages and kind of practicing it enough so that it becomes on autopilot, that's not only the process of building a habit, but we're also kind of describing the process of learning. This is how we go through life. It's kind of weird because a lot of the time life feels reactive. Like somebody says something and I feel a certain way, or somebody does something and I respond. But in a sense, life is always endlessly predictive. We're endlessly going into a situation, predicting how to respond based on the current circumstance and our past experiences, and then based on the outcome of that response, updating our prediction for next time. And habits are formed when the cue, the context of that action, and the prediction become reliable. Where like we face the same kind of situation again and again, we make the same prediction again and again, we take the same response again and again, and we eventually automate it because it keeps getting the outcome that we desire. And if that outcome changes, then we update and shift for next time. But a habit occurs when you can go through all of those 4 stages more or less without having to think about it.
So James, what then happens when you don't have all 4 of those elements of a habit?
So the cue is the thing that prompts the behavior or triggers the action. So if there's no cue, you don't get started on it. If there's no craving, if you don't desire to change your state, if you don't have the desire to take the action, or if you're not motivated to take it, essentially is what the craving is about, then you're not going to do it. If you have the cue and you're motivated, but it's too difficult, if the response is too hard, then you're not going to take the action. And if any of those 3 are missing, then you're not going to be able to perform the behavior. If all 3 are there, but then it's not rewarding, you're going to update your behavior the next time. That's kind of the second purpose of the reward. The first purpose is to satisfy your craving. The second purpose is that it teaches you. It teaches you what to do and what to avoid for next time. So this is something that I refer to as the cardinal rule of behavior change. Behaviors that are immediately rewarded get repeated. Behaviors that are immediately punished get avoided. And so the reward acts as like a learning signal to your brain about what to do and what to avoid next time. And you really need all four if you want a habit to form. You need the first three if you want to do a behavior at least once. But if you want to repeat it, then you need the fourth stage as well.
Well, and that's the thing, is that all of this stuff is fascinating to think, because again, we don't realize how many of these thought processes go into the things that we do every day. And so I guess I want to caution that, you don't have to sit there and think through all of these four stages when evaluating your habits, because that can kind of get you into a mind loop right there, trying to figure out what's what. But just the sheer fact of being aware that there are certain things that affect good habits and bad habits. In changing bad habits, though, you talk about taking away some of those things, in terms of taking away the cue, like it's not visible, taking away the craving. Talk about how you can change negative habits by doing a little bit of this inverse of the four.
So first of all, this is, I agree with you, like discussing the structure of a habit. We need to understand how habits work, but what we really need is a framework for how to adjust a habit, for how to change a habit, either building a good one or breaking a bad one. And that's why I came up with what I refer to as the 4 laws of behavior change. So we have cue, craving, response, and reward. Those are the 4 stages that all habits and most human behaviors are going to be going through. For building a good habit, there's a law for each stage. So for the cue, you want to make it obvious. That's the first law, make it obvious. For the craving, you want to make it attractive. For the response, you want to make it easy. And for the reward, you want to make it satisfying. So those 4 laws of behavior change help you build good habits. Make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. If you want to break a bad habit, then you just invert the 4 laws. So rather than making the cues obvious, you want to make them invisible. So make it invisible, make it unattractive, make it difficult, make it unsatisfying. And once you have that little framework, now you have actually like a practical way to approach changing your habits. And to answer your question, okay, what can we actually do about breaking bad habits? Personally, I think that the 2 most effective places to start if you're trying to break a bad habit is with the inversion of the first law and inversion of the third law. So make it invisible and make it difficult. So I'll give you an example of each. Take the habit of watching too much television. A lot of people feel like they spend too much time watching a screen. So for the first law, you want to make it invisible. So you want to make the cues less obvious. You want to reduce your exposure to the things that prompt the bad habit. So, if you walk into pretty much any living room, like what is that room designed to get you to do? So you could take the remote control and you could like put it in a drawer. You could take the television and put it in a wall unit so that it's, or a cabinet. So it's behind doors. You're less likely to see it. But the less obvious it is, the less likely you'll be triggered to watch it. So that's reducing exposure. So reducing exposure and making it invisible is the first step. But then the second thing that you could do is invert that third law. So rather than make it easy, which is what you want to do with your good habits, you want to make it difficult. And if we go back to the television example, you could unplug the TV. It makes it very difficult. And then you only watch something if you want to watch it bad enough. Now, there are varying levels of extremity here. But the point is just that you want to reduce the number of steps between you and the good behaviors and increase the number of steps, increase the amount of friction between you and the bad behaviors. And I think if you do those 2 things, if you reduce exposure by making the cues invisible and you increase friction by making it difficult to perform the action, then those are 2 things that you can do to try to resolve a bad habit. And I think that that's something that's true about a lot of our bad habits, especially our technology habits. They're so convenient, so frictionless, so obvious that we find ourselves sliding into them, even if we don't really want to do them in a deeper sense. And so while the examples I just gave of reducing exposure, make it invisible, make it difficult, increase friction, while I'm not saying that those are going to help like curb or fix a true addiction, I do think you'll find that a lot of our bad behaviors will fade away just if you make them a little more difficult than they were otherwise. Because the reason that you do them now is not really because you have some deep, like meaningful craving to do them, but simply because they're so obvious and so frictionless and so easy.
Another example that you mentioned in the book, it was either a store or an office environment. In addition to the soda machines, they added more water stations, and they found the without having to make any, declaration of let's be healthier, let the employees' behavior change to consume more water versus sodas, right?
Right. Yeah. So this was in a hospital cafeteria. And so both the people visiting the hospital and the employees who work there, they were basically able to change their drinking and consumption habits without having to say anything to them, just by making water more available in the cafeteria, making sure it was by the cash registers and in every refrigerator. Based on the study, a large portion of people before were drinking Coke just because it was obvious. And then after, they were drinking water just because that was a little more obvious. And so many of our behaviors are response to the cues in the environment.
Definitely. And so I guess it seems like something that's on its very basis seems like common sense that, okay, make things easier for yourself. So put healthier foods in reach and kind of hide away the unhealthier foods and make it a little bit more difficult. But I think what's fascinating, as it's pointed out in the book, is that this is all science-based, and it's all based on these invisible processes that happen in our minds.
Well, it's important to realize that even if it is common sense, and it may be, saying everybody already knows that is very different than saying everybody already does that.
That's true.
So there are many things that we know are good for us or are productive or effective, but we don't do them each day. And so I think it's useful to point them out and talk about how to structure them in the most effective way, because it's rare that you'll find a person who has all of that optimized. And so in essence, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for all of us, because we walk around all day thinking, yeah, I know what would be the most optimal solution, but then we don't design it for ourselves. We don't live in an optimal environment.
So that gap then between what you know you should do and what you actually do. I mean, that's a huge thing to be able to overcome, because it's not just a matter of willpower. I think that's maybe a misconception, or at least has been my thought of, well, why don't you do the things that you should do? I don't have the willpower to do it. But you're saying there's much more to it than that.
Well, there's certainly much more to it. We've talked a little bit about like the first and third laws of behavior change, but one reason why we don't follow through on things that we know we should do or would like to do is because of the second and the fourth laws. So this comes down to like which habits are attractive. So remember, the second law is make it attractive. Fourth law is make it satisfying. Well, in many cases, you can know that something makes sense, or you can know that you want to perform a particular habit, but you don't because it's not attractive to do so within the tribe that you're a part of. So all of us are part of multiple tribes. Some of those tribes are large, like what it means to be American, or what it means to be French, or what it means to be Buddhist, or something like that. Some of the tribes are smaller, like what it means to be a member of your local CrossFit gym, or a volunteer at the local school, or a neighbor who lives on your street. But all of these tribes, all of these groups, large and small, that you belong to, they have a set of shared expectations for their particular group. Maybe for the CrossFit group, the shared expectation is that you'll eat paleo because that's what most other people eat there. And what ends up happening is that for whatever groups that you're a part of, the ones that you become friends with, the ones that you want to belong to, you end up acting in accordance with what other people do at that or in that tribe. So, if you join a company, then the office culture that you're in, that's a part of a tribe. And if everybody there dresses in business casual or wears jeans on Friday, then you start doing the same thing because that's what the normal behavior is in that group. But the shared expectations of the group nudge you in a particular direction. And this is a deeper lesson about why we do certain habits and why we avoid others, which is that when habits go with the expectations of the group, they're very attractive. And when habits go against the grain of the expectations of the group, they're very unattractive. And so something can make common sense to you, something can be a goal that you want to achieve, but if it runs counter to the group that you're a part of, if it is going to make you cast out instead of fit in, then it's not very attractive for us to do.
That's a fascinating take on what some people would say, the 5 people that you surround yourself with, you become the average of.
Right. It's the same kind of idea.
Yeah.
I mean, there's basically peer pressure can work for you or against you, right? And if you're in a group where, and this is the phrase that I use in the book, you want to join a group where your desired behavior is the normal behavior. Like take exercise. For a lot of people, when they get started with exercise, it feels like a sacrifice. They feel out of place at the gym. They feel like they're being judged by other people or uncomfortable when they're in there. And so it feels like there's a lot of effort required to just go and do a workout. But there are also people that working out each week, just it feels normal. It's not like a sacrifice to them. It's just what they do. And if you can join a group where people feel like that, and then gradually start to develop friendships there and start to belong to that tribe, then suddenly it's going to feel much easier for you to also see exercise as something that's just normal to do and not a huge sacrifice. And that's really, I mean, that lesson extends to almost any socially reinforced habit. So in that way, the expectations of the tribe can either be something that raises you up or something that holds you back.
When you were doing the research for the book, well, one thing that you say is that, you never fancied yourself a writer. You just kind of built the habit of writing. And so you made yourself write for a certain amount of time, twice a week. And that became a habit. It was a routine that eventually, blossomed into the book that's out this month. So when you started studying all these things and becoming an expert in it, you were, as you say in the book, you're just basically practicing and learning and trying things out along with your readers to try to find what are the best ways to create good habits and to break bad ones. So I'm curious then, in your research, what did you find was the most surprising thing that you didn't expect, that you really thought it was maybe the opposite, or it was a huge click moment, like that's why I do that?
Well, there were really two things. So the first one was, I hinted at it earlier, but this idea that life is predictive rather than reactive, that was a real surprise for me. I wasn't thinking about human behavior in that way, and I hadn't seen any frameworks that had described it in that way. But once I recognized it, it started to answer some questions that I had. So like a very common framework for describing behavior is what I would call like a behavioral psychology approach. So this started with this behavioral psychology approach started with B.F. Skinner in the 1930s, and really even a couple decades before that. I mentioned the research study by Edward Thorndike, which was done right around 1900. I cover that in chapter 3 of the book. But anyway, the point is these researchers discovered that you had some kind of cue that prompted the behavior, and you got some kind of reward, some kind of outcome for the behavior. And this method, this model has been kind of reinvigorated and popularized by The Power of Habit as well, and some other writing recently. But the idea is that you have a cue and then you respond to that cue and then you get the outcome. But I had some questions about that because I was like, well, how come the same, like two people respond to a cue in a different way? Like you can have a pack of cigarettes on the table and two people walk into the room, and one of them is a smoker and they see the pack of cigarettes and immediately have this like craving to smoke. But then another person who like hasn't smoked, they look at the pack of cigarettes and they're like, well, what, it doesn't mean anything. Like they don't feel anything. They don't have the urge to go smoke or whatever. But that's not what the model says. The model says, hey, there's a cue, then the response follows, and then there's some kind of outcome. So it didn't really explain why people's behavior would differ. And then it also doesn't really explain like why the same person would respond to the same cue in a different way, depending on things. Like say you walk into the kitchen in the morning and you see, like a loaf of bread on the counter, and you're like, oh, I need to make some toast. And so you see the loaf of bread cue, you make some toast, you eat it, you have the rest of your breakfast. But then 10 minutes later, you've finished breakfast and you walk back into the kitchen from the dining room and you see the loaf of bread again. But this time, same cue, loaf of bread on the counter, morning in my kitchen, but you don't have the urge to make a toast anymore. And it wasn't until I realized that life was predictive, that all of our actions are preceded by some kind of interpretation, that made sense. Because then you can say, oh, those two people, they're looking at the cigarette. Like one of them sees the cue and they interpret it based on their past experiences as, hey, whenever I smoke a cigarette, I feel more relaxed. It helps calm my nerves. I feel like I get to fit in with other people who are smoking. I get to, satisfy my craving for nicotine. There's all this expectation that's built in to how they interpret the cue. And the second person doesn't have any of that. They see it. They've never smoked a cigarette and they're like, oh yeah, whatever. It's just, a pack of cigarettes. I don't think about it anymore. Same thing with the person who walks into the kitchen before they've eaten and they see the loaf of bread and their expectation is, my stomach is empty. I need to eat. Like it's early in the morning. It's time for breakfast and so on. But then they walk back in after breakfast is over, see the same cue, and their state has changed. And so their interpretation of the cue has changed. And that's what leads to the different outcome. So it's actually, once I started to understand the importance of those predictions and how they're based on both past experience and our current state, I started to more deeply understand how habits and human behavior works, what motivates us to take action, and why we have these differing experiences, both within the same person and across people. And I think that that's incredibly crucial for understanding how habits work and puts a little bit of a finer point on how human behavior functions and maybe gives us a better set of tools for dealing with it and shaping it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, James, really good, thought-provoking stuff. Now, James, before I let you go, I've got just a couple of quick hit questions for you. You ready?
Let's do it.
All right. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten?
Ooh, really tough. The two that immediately come to my mind, one was very early on in my entrepreneurial career. I was told, try things until something comes easily. And I think that lesson of like iterate, experiment, be willing to try a variety of things, that extends to a lot of areas in life, not just entrepreneurship. And the second one, my dad would always tell me before I had like a big game or a big performance, an important test. But he would just say, trust your preparation. And there's a lot that's built into that. You can only trust your preparation if you actually prepare. And so it showcases like most battles are won long before they actually begin. Most games are won on the practice field and in the gym. Most tests are aced in, the library or while you're studying. It's not actually the performance itself that determines the outcome. And then secondly, it shows that confidence kind of comes from displayed ability. If you've prepared, then you know that you can do it. You know that you can, answer the question correctly or perform on the field and so on. And so in a sense, it's like confidence comes out of repetition, not from some like magical well of willpower or mindset or something like that.
Right. And that's a great point because I think everyone wants that ever-flowing fountain of confidence. And you're right. It does come from that repetition and I guess the confidence in knowing that you can do something. So what's the worst piece of advice you've ever gotten?
Well, I like the phrase of good advice at the wrong time is bad advice. And
yeah.
I think that that is probably where people go wrong most of the time. It's not that the ideas they get are bad. It's that we don't realize that those ideas are not appropriate for our particular circumstance. That can be hard to parse through, but I also think that it's important just to have that approach in general, because a lot of the time people can share good ideas. And then what we want like this handbook, this like list, this checklist to follow where it's like, just do these steps and then it'll work out. But life isn't like that. And you need to be willing to wrestle with how to map good ideas onto your own experience or your own goals. And only if you have the willingness to do that, which requires a little bit of what we just mentioned, a little bit of self-experimentation, this willingness to iterate and apply things or test things out. Only if you have that willingness does good advice like stand a chance of serving you.
Really
because if you just hope to
we'll
get a checklist
time.
And follow it exactly,
Bye.
and then everything will work out the way you
Bye-bye.
hoped, like it's not,
Bye.
it doesn't work that way.
Bye-bye. What movie can you quote by heart?
Oh man. Well, it's kind of it's a classic, but I'll say Dumb and Dumber.
All right.
I have so many stupid ideas banging around my head. I can, when I was a kid, I memorized Duck Dodgers in Outer Space, which was a book. And I thought it was the first book I could read, but I actually couldn't read yet.
Right.
I just knew like every word that was on every page. And Dumb and Dumber is kind of like that.
Well, and then finally, based on the conversation that we've had today, we've talked about atomic habits, basically just small little habits build into bigger systems and processes. And these are all ways that you can make yourself better day by day. So with all of that being said, what do you think is the secret to your success?
There are a couple different ways to look at that question. My first inclination is to say, I'm just a work in progress. I'm just trying to get better. But that is kind of instructive in itself, which shows that maybe the answer is continuous improvement or a willingness to keep working regardless of what the outcome is, even if it is a quote unquote successful one. But, if we're just going to pause my life at this moment and say, okay, right now you're a success. What led to that? Then I guess I'll say putting in the reps. There's no real way to cheat that. there's no way to cheat in the gym. You know, if you want to squat 300 pounds, like there's a certain number of reps you need to go through to do that. But the only way to get there is to put the reps in. And I like using the gym as a metaphor for life. And same thing could be said for like my writing career. There were a certain number of reps or a certain number of articles that I had to put in to get to 1 million visitors a month. And for me, it was, I don't know, a couple hundred. But the only way to do that is, well, guess I better start writing another article. So I think that philosophy of putting in the work, not just mindlessly, but trying your best each time and cataloging those reps is perhaps the secret to it.
James, thank you so much.
Thank you.